This week, the focus of the class is Great Depression and the New Deal, dated roughly from 1929 to 1941. Our key learning outcomes are going to be: we want to explain the underlying causes of the Depression and evaluate President Hoover's attempts to help the economy, describe the experiences of both urban and rural Americans during the Depression, and explain ways in which the Depression affected American politics. We want to evaluate Franklin Delano Roosevelt's actions designed to alleviate the effects of the Depression and discuss some of the opposition that he faced. And we also want to discuss the most significant long-term effects of the New Deal. So what are the origins and causes of the Great Depression? Now, last week we learned that there was this stock market crash that happened in 1929 in October. And things started to take a turn for the worse significantly, not only in the United States, but also globally. So what are the origins and the causes? We have extreme wealth inequalities that are developing during the 1920s. Standard of living is being raised for all Americans, but those at the upper end of the social economic ladder are gaining far more wealth than those at the lower rungs of the social economic ladder. We have a ballooning stock market, over-reliance on unprotected loans. There's too much speculation and borrowing. There's overproduction and uneven distribution capabilities. So banks lacked money, people lost savings, debts were called in, and there's no cash in the banks. Fall in demand for consumer goods leading factories to slow production. Workers take pay cuts, then laid off, then fired. This new consumer economy that was developed during the 1920s, well, it was new. And so some of the potential problems that a society could encounter becoming and transitioning into a consumer economy weren't recognized. They weren't experienced yet. So to put it in a more simplistic slide, what we have as our causes for the Great Depression is going to be the stock market crash, stalled markets for agricultural goods, and a fall in demand for consumer goods that lead factories to slow production. And of course, those effects are going to be first declining wages, then unemployment, then starvation. If your employees and your workers, in effect your consumers, have declining wages, then so too is their purchasing power for these new consumer items that Americans were supposed to acquire as part of being in this new economy. And then, of course, when they lose their jobs, Americans can't even afford basic services, let alone hair dryers or cigarettes or any number of consumer items. So let's just take a look at some of the economics and politics of the Depression and have these numbers sink in. 9,000 banks closed between 1929 and 1933. 9,000. The United States' gross national product is going to decline significantly, and our unemployment rate is going to skyrocket from 3.2% in 1929 to nearly 25% in 1933. And there will be pockets of unemployment across the country where these numbers will be far higher. Take, for example, Cleveland, Ohio would have 25% unemployment, whereas Toledo, Ohio, 80% of the people who live in that city are unemployed. What do you think is going to happen to city and social services in that particular municipality when there's just absolutely no tax base, when 80% of the tax wealth that drives the local government is no longer there? So who's in the White House at the beginning of the Great Depression? Well, that's going to be Herbert Hoover. Now, Hoover came to the position of the presidency with a fantastic resume. This is an individual who, he was a self-made man. He made great amount of wealth in mines, but because he was a self-made man, he believes in this idea that, in America called rugged individualism. A person has to get to work by themselves on the fruits of their own intelligence and labor. That's how someone is going to rise through the economic system in the United States to achieve the American dream. That's what he did. That's what individuals like Rockefeller and Carnegie were able to do. And when you're coming from that position, you're a self-made man. He's very opposed to direct federal aid, an idea of, simplistically stated, writing a check for someone in America that's starving to give them the ability to feed themselves. For Hoover, that's going to be the wrong approach, because then that person is going to become dependent on government largesse, potentially for the rest of their lives, and never go through the trial by fire that one has to in order to be successful. So his process for dealing with the Great Depression focused mostly on self-help and volunteerism, soup kitchens, different religious institutions, and charitable organizations organizations. Hoover's administration would work with them in order to help to provide services that Americans needed that were struggling through the Depression, but it was just never enough. Part of President Hoover's official response, he will oversee the organization of the most inartfully named initiative a president has put their name to. The President's Organization on Unemployment Relief, acronym POOR. This was an organization designed to persuade local organizations to raise money and form voluntary groups. Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the RFC. This is a federally funded agency that wasn't loaning money to individuals, it was loaning money to businesses in order to hire more workers. Work with businesses, that was going to be Hoover's approach, rather than try and provide direct aid to individuals that found themselves unemployed. Now, these ideas based on voluntary cooperation, they're only going to go so far. And so he's going to ask business leaders to make sacrifices for the nation. Instead of laying off or outright firing workers in a particular organization, the idea was perhaps someone who's in the company further up can take a modest pay cut so that one of these workers that otherwise would be laid off could maintain a position within the company. As far as international finance is concerned, Hoover is going to sign something called the Hawley-Smoot tariff in 1930. And this is a classical kind of concept for what you do during an economic downturn. You protect your domestic industries by passing a tariff on competitors that are being imported into the country. This is going to trigger European retaliation. The United States is not the only country that's dealing with the Great Depression. This is a global economic downturn. And so when the United States raises tariffs on foreign goods coming into the country, the European countries are going to raise tariffs on American goods coming into their respective countries. Now, moreover, last week we discussed the Versailles Treaty and the reparation payments that were demanded from Germany. Well, Germany was making its reparation payments to Great Britain and France, largely on the fact that it was exporting goods to the United States. It would use the money generated from those exports to then pay the reparations to Great Britain and France. Now, Great Britain and France were using the reparation payments that they were getting from Germany to pay off the loans they owed to the United States. So when the Hoover administration passes the Hawley-Smoot tariff, it not only creates retaliatory tariffs that make American goods more expensive to be sold in foreign markets, but it also throws a serious spammer into the mechanism of payments from Germany to Great Britain and France, which then use that money to pay back the loans that they owed to the United States. And this is going to just double down on the Depression and make it that much worse. Here's our political cartoon from the era. Blame it on Hoover. So Hoover is in this position where he's getting it from all sides. He's not doing enough from those on the left, of course, and he's doing things by those on the right. And when the Hawley-Smoot tariff blows up in Hoover's face as much as it did, he becomes gung-shy. Basically, I told you so. My political philosophy was to not get involved in the economy. And when the government did forcefully get involved in the economy by raising a tariff, look what happened. Things went from bad to worse. And so Hoover's constantly saying, well, we just have to work through this. The recovery is just around the corner. But with every single week that he's saying that, more banks are going out of business. More people who had money in those banks are losing their life savings. They're losing their jobs. So what's going on in the urban experience in America when it comes to the Great Depression? Hoover's name is going to be on everybody's lips, and not in a good way. We're going to see these shanty towns that are going to develop during the Great Depression, and they will be called Hoovervilles. Makeshift towns that are built by homeless Americans out of anything and everything that they can get their hands on. The Hoover blanket, as we can see from this image here, we'll take a hard look at what a Hoover blanket is. It's a newspaper. Newspaper for your mattress and a newspaper for your bedspread. And here's some images of different shanty towns that are popping up all over the United States during the Great Depression. And so when you have a situation like this, social revolution starts to become a significant worry. 25% of Americans are unemployed. Many are losing their generated wealth. The American dream can truly have a question mark added to it at this particular time because it seems more like a nightmare. So what's going on with cultural politics? There are going to be many Americans that will look to escape from the harsh realities of modern life, and they're going to do that by attending films. 60% of the nation, still at the height of the Depression, is going to attend a minimum of one film a week. And for writers who in the 1920s were spending most of their time in Paris, Hemingway, Dos Passos, etc., they're having their I told you so moment, that this consumer culture that was being created in the United States really does look artificial and spacious by the mid-1930s. Those concerns that they had seem to be realized in the Great Depression. The Great Depression, insofar as cultural achievements are concerned, John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath is widely considered to be the greatest American novel ever written. And it was based on the Joad family losing their farm in the Midwest and traveling on this odyssey, heading west for a better life. And these intellectuals, they're going to call for the government to get far more involved than what Hoover is prepared to do. And so what are the movies that individuals are going to see? Well, Charlie Chaplin's going to be big in the 1930s. Modern Time, about this likable individual who's besieged by huge anonymous forces in the industrial era. Who is in control of whom here? Is it really man in control of the machine, or is the machine in control of the man? Radio is going to be the great cultural and political homogenizer during the 1930s. We have our first nationwide radio networks that are being created in 1926. The radio is going to serve as a major source of news for the American people. But when people's bellies are empty, it becomes very easy to fill their heads with ideas that could be considered radical. So the Communist Party is making inroads in the United States, despite the Red Scare that had happened. The Communist Party at this point is going to be led by Earl Browder and William Z. Foster. And ideas like eliminating private property and making the state responsible for people are going to resonate, especially when you own no private property and it doesn't seem like the government cares about you one iota. And so one of the biggest issues that we need to discuss during the Hoover administration that led to a openness to new ideas is the bonus army. These are World War I veterans who staged a protest for immediate payment of a bonus that they were supposed to get in 1945, but they needed the money now. So they're going to descend upon Washington, D.C. and demand that they get their bonus. And the Senate is going to be voting on this. That's going to be defeated 62-18. And everyone in Washington, all the politicians, are thinking, well, what's going to happen with this bonus army? Are they going to leave or not? And Hoover decides not to wait. He calls in General Douglas MacArthur with the regular army to forcefully remove these World War I veterans from Washington, D.C. They evict them from their main camp, and this is going to create deep anger and resentment at the government. It's going to deepen class divisions, and the country is ready for Hoover to go, basically, after he called on the regular army to remove this army of World War I vets. And 1932 is an election year. Franklin Roosevelt is going to win the Democratic nomination in July of 1932. One person will write into the White House while Hoover is still in office and say, President Hoover, make it unanimous and vote for FDR as well. FDR is going to win 22.8 million votes. We can see just how much of a stomping in the Electoral College this 1932 election was. From the electoral vote, 89% in the Electoral College. The one reason why Pennsylvania is an outlier here with its 36 key Electoral College vote is because that's where Hoover is from. It's his home state. Next part of the series is going to look at Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his approach to the Depression and the First New Deal.